Good evening, friends. Tonight, we journey back through the mists of time to a land where legends and laws intertwined in ways that might make you pause, perhaps even chuckle, yet were taken quite seriously by those who lived them. A land where the green hills were dotted with ring forts and the air was thick with stories of old. We are headed to ancient Ireland, a world of oddities and peculiarities that seem almost too strange to be true. Now, as you settle into your bed, dim your lights, and relax into the softness of your blanket, allow your mind to wander. Imagine the warmth of a fire crackling nearby, the faint scent of moss and earth filling the air. The night is calm, the wind whispers through the trees, and the stories of ancient Ireland unfold in your mind. If this calm journey helps you unwind, tap like and subscribe, only if it feels right. Tonight, we'll explore a world where punishments were not merely about enforcing laws. They were about rituals, bizarre ceremonies, and even strange symbols of loyalty. These weren't your ordinary punishments. Oh no. These were the kinds of things that might make you wonder. How did they even think of that? Let's dive in and discover together how bizarre and fascinating the world of ancient Irish justice could be. Imagine, for a moment, you are standing on the misty hills of ancient Ireland. The wind rustles through the tall grasses, and the air smells of damp earth and burning peat. In the distance, you see a ring fort, its tall wooden walls standing proudly against the landscape, a fortress of ancient times. It's the heart of the kingdom, and at its center sits the king, the one who holds the balance between life and death, prosperity and famine, health and sickness. Now, imagine being one of the king's closest allies, someone who has sworn loyalty to him, who stands with him in times of war and peace. But how do you prove that loyalty, especially in a time when honor is everything and words alone are not enough? In ancient Ireland, a land where the Bréan laws ruled, loyalty was often sealed in the strangest of ways that might make you wonder if there was some deep symbolic meaning behind the actions, or if they were simply bizarre customs born from the unique worldview of the time. One such act of loyalty is the ritual of the king's nipple. Yes, you heard that right, the king's nipple. The ancient Irish king was not just a ruler. He was believed to be the embodiment of the land's health, prosperity, and fortune. His body was sacred, and to touch it, to make contact with it in any way, was a highly symbolic act. Imagine this. You are standing before the king, and to show your loyalty, you must touch the king's nipple. Why the nipple, you might ask? Well, this ritual was meant to symbolize the king's role as a provider, much like a mother nourishes her child. The king's body was seen as the vessel of life itself, and so an act of fealty would not just involve a handshake or a pledge. It involved a highly personal and deeply symbolic act of touching, almost as if to draw the king's strength and protection into your own body. The ceremony, which was known as the sucking of the king's nipple, might sound odd by modern standards, but to the ancient Irish, it was a deeply serious act. It was a reminder that the king's health was tied to the health of the kingdom. The king's power was not simply political, it was spiritual. To touch the king's body in this most intimate of ways was a way of sharing in his vitality, in his connection to the land. In some ways, it made the act of loyalty almost primal, an unspoken pact that said, "I am yours, and you are mine." Now let's pause for a moment and consider just how bizarre this might seem today. Imagine if, in our own world, we swore allegiance to someone by something as personal as that. You might be wondering, what on earth could have made this ritual seem appropriate or even necessary? But in ancient Ireland, This act was believed to protect not only the individual who performed it, but also the entire kingdom. After all, if the king was strong, healthy, and connected to his people in such a personal way, his reign would be prosperous, and so would the land. In ancient times, the king's body was almost seen as a conduit for power. The idea was that if the king was physically perfect, then the land itself would thrive, and that was why the act of touching the king in such an intimate way was considered a powerful act of loyalty. The king was the living embodiment of the health of the kingdom, and his protection, his strength, flowed through these rituals. But not everyone was comfortable with such an intimate act. As you can imagine, the act of sucking the king's nipple was often reserved for those who were closest to him, those who had sworn fealty and were willing to submit to this deeply personal bond. It was a way of showing that they were completely devoted to the king, that they were willing to be nourished by him, as the land was nourished by his rule. It wasn't just about loyalty. It was about being a part of the king's spiritual and physical essence. So let's take a moment to picture the scene. The king sits, regal and commanding, upon his throne in the heart of the ring fort. The fire crackles nearby, sending dancing shadows on the walls. The smell of roasting meat and bubbling stews fills the air, mingling with the earthy scent of wood and peat. His advisors, his warriors, his closest allies are gathered around, each one waiting their turn to show their loyalty. And then, one by one, they approach. Each one kneels before the king and, in a ritualistic display of submission and loyalty, places their mouth against his nipple. It is, of course, not just a simple gesture. It is a symbol of the bond between them and the ruler, the one who holds their fate in his hands. The act itself is symbolic, almost sacred, and yet it is a deeply personal and intimate connection between the king and his followers. It is a reminder that the health of the king is the health of the kingdom. Now, it's important to remember that this wasn't just about loyalty. It was about physical and spiritual power. The act of swearing loyalty to the king through this strange ritual was also a way of ensuring the prosperity of the land. The king's body was tied to the fate of the people, and so his protection was seen as a divine responsibility. By touching him in this intimate way, the warrior or noble swore not only his loyalty, but his trust in the king's ability to protect and provide. But what happened if the king's body became damaged or impaired in any way? If he lost his strength, his health, or his vitality, it wasn't just a personal failure. It was seen as a failure of the land itself. The king's body, once perfect and powerful, became a direct reflection of the kingdom's fate. If the king faltered, so too did the land, and so the people would suffer. This ritual, though strange to us today, was one of many bizarre yet deeply meaningful acts that governed the lives of ancient Irish people. It was a way of ensuring that the bond between the ruler and his people was not just political, but deeply personal and spiritual. The king was not just a man. He was the embodiment of the land itself. And through rituals like this, the ancient Irish ensured that his strength and health would remain in balance with that of the kingdom. As we leave this strange and sacred ceremony behind, let's think for a moment about the deeper meaning of this bond. How did the people of ancient Ireland view their kings? Were they truly divine beings? Or was there something more to this complex system of loyalty and power? And as the night deepens and the wind whispers through the trees, you're left to wonder. In a world where such rituals were seen as essential to the health of the kingdom, what other bizarre customs might have existed? What other odd, intimate acts were performed in the name of loyalty, power, and protection? Imagine for a moment, standing under the wide clouded sky of ancient Ireland. The air is thick with mist swirling in from the sea, and the scent of wet earth and damp stone fills your senses. You stand near the heart of a bustling village, where the sound of a blacksmith's hammer ringing against an anvil echoes across the land. But despite the busy noise, there's a stillness in the air, an anticipation, a tension that doesn't quite belong to the ordinary rhythms of daily life. This is a world where the people's laws and customs are not just legalities. They are woven into the very fabric of their existence, and breaking these laws can bring consequences so severe, so strange, that they might seem impossible to imagine today. The Brehon laws, those intricate ancient codes that governed every aspect of life in Ireland, were not just about punishments. They were about maintaining the delicate balance of honor, reputation, and respect. For in this society, honor was everything. A person standing, their dignity, their respect in the eyes of others. These were things that could never be taken lightly. So, when a person committed a crime, whether it was something as small as an insult or as large as betrayal, the punishment often went far beyond a simple fine. It was a way of stripping away not just their freedom, but their very sense of self. In the harsh, honor-bound world of ancient Ireland, there was one punishment that was both feared and respected. One that would break down a person's identity in front of everyone they knew. The skin and bone punishment. This was no ordinary punishment. It wasn't a quick sentence of jail time or a simple fine to be paid. No, this was a ritual of public humiliation, a stripping away of a person's social status, their reputation, and their very dignity. And it happened in the most public of settings, so that the entire community would witness it. Let me tell you how it worked. Imagine a small, tight-knit village in ancient Ireland, its wooden huts clustered together and surrounded by the cool, soft earth of the countryside. The people lived their lives by the Brehon laws, ancient codes passed down from generation to generation, a set of rules that cover everything from the rights of animals to the laws of hospitality. These are the laws that bind the people together, creating a sense of unity, a sense of justice. But when someone breaks these laws, the consequences can be severe. In the case of the skin and bone punishment, the wrongdoer was stripped, yes, stripped of everything. They were made to stand before the entire village, exposed and vulnerable. But it wasn't just their clothes that were taken away. It was their very honor, their identity, their status. You see, in ancient Ireland, a person's honor was tied directly to their reputation in the community. If that honor was damaged, the individual was left to face not just physical punishment, but the loss of their very identity. As you stand in the crowd, watching this grim spectacle unfold before your eyes, you feel a chill run through you. It is not just the cold air. It is the discomfort of watching someone who was once an equal, reduced to nothing. The wrongdoer is standing there shivering in the open, stripped of their clothes, their dignity laid bare for all to see. They are now nothing more than skin and bone. But why such a strange and cruel punishment? What purpose did it serve? The idea behind the skin and bone punishment was deeply rooted in the ancient Irish belief that the body and honor were inseparable. If you damaged someone's honor, it wasn't just their reputation you were harming, it was their very essence. So the skin and bone punishment wasn't just about humbling the wrongdoer. It was about publicly and physically demonstrating their fall from grace. In a society where reputation was everything, to be publicly humiliated in this way was to have your identity shattered, leaving you exposed not just in body, but in spirit. The penalty, though harsh, was not meant to be permanent. It wasn't designed to kill the person, but to break them down. It was a way of forcing them to reckon with their own actions, to confront the shame they had brought upon themselves and their community. In a way, it was a necessary evil, a way of restoring balance to the society. Let's pause for a moment to reflect on how strange this punishment might seem to us today. In modern times, when someone breaks the law, they might go to prison, or pay a fine, or face some other consequence. But in ancient Ireland, the focus was less on the punishment itself and more on restoring the balance of honor. The community's sense of justice wasn't about retribution. It was about ensuring that the social order remained intact. But back to the scene. The wrongdoer, now stripped of all outward trappings of their identity, is forced to stand there, humiliated and vulnerable. The crowd watches, some with pity, some with judgment. The wrongdoer might shift uncomfortably, their hands fidgeting at their sides, unsure of what to do, unsure of how to make things right. They are exposed in every way, not just in body, but in soul. And here lies the most powerful aspect of this punishment, the communal aspect. The entire village witnesses this act. The entire community sees the wrongdoer brought low, and in doing so, they too are forced to reckon with the crime. The punishment is a public display of justice, a way of showing that the law applies to everyone, no matter how high or low their status. It is a social contract in action, an agreement that the rules of society must be respected by all, and that when those rules are broken, the consequences are felt by everyone. Imagine the silence that falls over the crowd as the wrongdoer stands there, stripped of everything. The wind rustles the leaves, the only sound other than the faint murmur of voices. The sense of discomfort in the air is palpable. This is not just a punishment. It is a ritual, a way of restoring order to a world where honor and reputation are everything. Now, let's think about how this punishment affected the community. In a place where honor was everything, where a person's identity was inextricably linked to their reputation, the skin and bone punishment wasn't just an act of punishment. It was an act of social reconstruction. It forced the wrongdoer to face the consequences of their actions, but it also reminded the community of the importance of maintaining their own honor. It was a social check, an enforced reminder that the balance of respect and trust within the group had to be maintained at all costs. In the end, the skin and bone punishment was about more than just humiliation. It was about restoration. It was about righting the wrongs that had been committed and reminding everyone that in the eyes of the law, no one was above reproach. But let's ask ourselves this: how did those who received such punishments ever rebuild their lives? How could they ever restore their honor, their dignity, after such a public and brutal display? Perhaps the answer lies in the very nature of the ancient Irish world. There was always the possibility of redemption, of regaining honor through actions, through deeds, through the careful rebuilding of trust. But that was the challenge. The journey to restore one's reputation wasn't just about paying a fine or serving time. It was about showing the community that you had learned from your mistake, that you could be trusted again. As we leave this grim punishment behind, we are left to reflect on the cost of breaking such a sacred bond. The skin and bone punishment may have been bizarre to us, but to the people of ancient Ireland, it was a necessary ritual, a way to restore balance, to cleanse the soul, and to remind everyone that honor, once lost, had to be earned back through both humility and strength. The fog rolls in thick and silent over the hills of ancient Ireland, swallowing the land whole in its cool embrace. The trees sway gently in the wind, their ancient branches creaking with the weight of time. The sky is heavy, its muted greyness a mirror of the somber mood that hangs over the kingdom. It's a quiet evening, the kind that invites reflection, and as you stand there on the edge of the ring fort, the distant sound of the drum beat fills the air. It's a ceremonial rhythm, slow and deliberate, reminding everyone that even the most solemn moments can have their own form of ritual. You're about to hear a story of a king, one who had the world at his feet, a king whose power was seen as a divine gift. His reign, long and prosperous, was the envy of many. But in a world where kings were the physical embodiments of the land's strength, his story took a dark turn, one marked by the very thing that had once given him so much power, his eyes. For in ancient Ireland, there was nothing more sacred than the sight of a king. His vision, his ability to see clearly, was tied to the health of the entire kingdom. And when that vision faltered, it was not just his reign that suffered, but the very fate of the land itself. This, my friend, is the tale of a king who was blinded, not by the hands of an enemy, but by his own body's betrayal. And once blinded, he faced a fate so peculiar, so intertwined with the spiritual beliefs of his people, that it would leave him marked not just by the loss of sight, but by the curse of his own weakness. Let me tell you how this came to be. In the world of ancient Ireland, kings were more than just rulers. They were seen as living gods, embodiments of the land itself. The health of the king was believed to be directly connected to the health of the kingdom. If the king was strong, the land would thrive, crops would grow in abundance, cattle would multiply, and the rivers would flow with vitality. But if the king was ill, if he suffered from injury or illness, it was seen as a sign that the kingdom itself was suffering, that the land was under threat. A king's body was sacred, and because of this, certain physical imperfections could lead to questions about his ability to rule. There were strict laws about the king's health. He was expected to remain unblemished, both in body and in spirit. No physical deformities, no illness, no signs of weakness. If he faltered in this regard, his reign could be questioned, his authority undermined. And the worst offense of all, a king who lost his sight. Imagine a king, in the prime of his reign, standing tall and proud before his people. His eyes, once sharp and clear, reflect the wisdom of 1,000 battles and the strength of a nation. But one day, something begins to change. Perhaps it's gradual at first, a slight clouding of his vision, a dullness in his gaze. Maybe it's a shadow passing over his eye, one that grows darker and more pronounced with each passing day. The king, feeling the change, dismisses it at first. It's nothing, he thinks, just the weight of years upon him. But then, his vision begins to fail. It's not just a loss of clarity, but an overwhelming darkness that closes in around him, consuming his sight. What happens when a king can no longer see? His authority begins to erode. The very thing that made him powerful, the sharpness of his mind, his ability to see the world clearly, starts to slip away. The people begin to notice the change. The once mighty king, who had commanded armies and led his people with a sharp eye and a firm hand, now stumbles, unsure of his surroundings. He is no longer the godlike figure that once stood at the center of the kingdom. He is a man, vulnerable and blind, cut off from the divine power that had once flowed through him. In ancient Irish culture, a king who lost his sight was seen as a king who had lost his connection to the gods. His blindness was not just a personal affliction, it was a spiritual curse. His ability to rule was compromised, and with it, the health of the kingdom. The land began to feel the effects. Crops withered. The cattle became sick. The rivers no longer flowed with the same vitality. The kingdom, once thriving under the king's rule, now began to decline, mirroring the king's own descent into darkness. But it wasn't just the loss of sight that caused the king's downfall. In ancient Ireland, the king's body was not just his own. It was a symbol. It was the embodiment of the land, the very essence of life itself. To be impaired in any way, to suffer a physical flaw, was a sign that the king was no longer fit to rule. And so, when the king's sight began to fail, it was not simply a matter of personal health. It was a matter of political necessity. The king's inability to see was seen as a threat to the balance of the kingdom. If the king could no longer see the land, how could he rule it? The laws of ancient Ireland were clear. A king who lost his sight could no longer lead. His reign was considered cursed, and it was not uncommon for such a king to be replaced, not by force, but by the will of the people. A blinded king was a king who had failed in his sacred duty to protect and provide for the land. And in the world of ancient Ireland, failure was not something that could be easily forgiven. But what happened to a king who was blinded? In many cases, the king's reign was simply ended, his position taken by someone else who was seen as more fit to rule. The new king would be chosen not only for his physical strength, but for his spiritual vitality, his ability to see the land and its people clearly, just as the gods had intended. The old king, now blind and impotent, would be left to wander in exile, a shadow of his former self. His body, once a vessel of divine power, was now a symbol of failure. There were some, however, who sought to hold on to their power, even in the face of blindness. These kings, desperate to maintain their authority, would often go to great lengths to hide their condition. They would surround themselves with advisors and trusted warriors who would act as their eyes, guiding them through the world, ensuring that the king's presence was still felt. But no matter how much they tried to mask the truth, the people knew. The king was no longer fit to rule, and the land would suffer for it. This wasn't just about the king's inability to lead. It was about the very fabric of the kingdom being torn apart. A king who lost his sight was seen as disconnected from the divine power that had once flowed through him, and when that power faltered, so too did the land. The health of the kingdom was intimately tied to the health of the king, and so the loss of sight was seen as a direct threat to the balance of the world itself. Now, as the king's blindness becomes more pronounced, the people look to the future with uncertainty. The once great ruler is now a ghost of his former self, his body no longer capable of holding the weight of leadership. His sight, once sharp and clear, is now a distant memory. And as he stands at the edge of his kingdom, he's left to wonder, what happens to a ruler when the very thing that made him powerful is taken away? How can a king lead when he cannot see? The answer in ancient Ireland was simple. The king could no longer lead. He was a king without sight, and that was a king without power. His reign was over, and the kingdom would continue on without him, looking to the next ruler who could restore the balance, who could bring back the health and vitality of the land. As we leave this tale behind, we are left with the knowledge that in ancient Ireland, the king's sight was not just a physical attribute. It was a symbol of his power, his connection to the gods, and his ability to rule. When that sight faltered, the kingdom faltered with it. The curse of the blind king was not just a personal tragedy. It was a tragedy for the land, a loss that could not be easily undone. The Irish landscape stretches out before you like a tapestry of fog and green, the mist rolling across the hills in soft, swirling waves, as though the earth itself is breathing. In the distance, the faint sound of a river, deep and endless, murmurs through the valley. It's a time before the comforts of modern life, where every element of nature felt raw, untamed, and deeply connected to the people who lived among it. Now, picture yourself standing at the center of an ancient wooden hall, the kind where the walls are thick with the weight of history. The stone hearth at the center crackles with fire, sending warm orange flickers across the rough-hewn beams above. The air is thick with the smell of roasting meat, fresh herbs, and the earthy scent of the land itself. You can hear the murmurs of conversation, the clink of goblets, the low hum of voices, all mingling together in the warmth of the evening. It's the kind of evening that feels both peaceful and tense. For the people gathered here are not just lords and ladies, warriors and bards. They are a community bound by tradition, by law, and by power. And in a world where power can be as fragile as the flicker of a flame, even the smallest misstep can lead to a fall from grace. In the warmth of the firelight, behind those murmuring voices, there is an undercurrent of fear, for there is one thing the people of ancient Ireland feared more than anything: betrayal. And when betrayal is not loud and obvious, but silent and creeping, it is all the more deadly. Let me tell you the story of one such betrayal. A betrayal that began not with a clash of steel or a shout of defiance, but with the quiet, almost invisible action of a poisoned chalice. It is a story that is as much about the fragility of trust as it is about the darker corners of the human soul, where loyalty can turn to treachery in the blink of an eye. Imagine the king, strong, revered, and mighty, his body the embodiment of his kingdom's strength. He is seated at the head of the table, surrounded by his trusted advisors and family, each one swearing fealty to him. There is a quiet celebration in the air, a gathering to honor his reign, to toast to a future filled with more victories and peace. The fire crackles, the soft scent of roasted meats and bread filling the room, as the laughter of the court dances with the evening's shadows. But even as his loyal subjects gather to toast the king's health, one among them harbors a darker intent. This is not a king who will fall to a sword or a spear. No, his downfall will be far more subtle, far more insidious. A silent poison in the form of a goblet of wine. For in ancient Ireland, poisoning was a quiet, effective form of treachery. A way to strike down a king without the loud clash of battle or the bloodshed that might bring consequences. The poison itself is no grand spectacle. There is no dramatic moment where the guilty party reveals themselves. Instead, the poisoner is patient, crafting the slow and subtle course of the king's decline. The poison is mixed into the king's goblet of wine, a drink that will not kill him immediately, but will take its time, working its dark magic over days and weeks. It is a poison that will leave no mark, no sign of its presence, except for the king's slow and inevitable decline. The king, of course, doesn't know. He doesn't feel the creeping weight of his impending doom as he raises the goblet to his lips, smiling at his loyal subjects. The wine is sweet, rich, full-bodied, and the king savors the taste. Little does he know, the very thing that nourishes him is slowly draining his strength, turning his once sharp mind into a clouded haze, his once powerful body into something weak, frail, and unreliable. At first, the symptoms are barely noticeable. Perhaps he feels a little more tired than usual, a little more sluggish. His thoughts, once quick and keen, seem to drift at times. He dismisses it as the toll of a long day, the weight of leadership. After all, a king is expected to carry heavy burdens. But as the days wear on, the king grows weaker. His eyes, once bright with the spark of authority, grow dull. His hands tremble slightly as he lifts the goblet once more, and his mind becomes fogged with a sense of confusion that he cannot shake. Those around him, his closest allies, his most trusted warriors, begin to notice the change. The king, once so sharp and clear in his commands, begins to falter, and with each misstep, each moment of uncertainty, the seeds of doubt begin to sprout. The land too seems to feel the effects of the king's decline. Crops fail to yield as they once did. The cattle, once healthy and strong, seem restless. The weather itself shifts, becoming colder, harsher, as if nature itself is reacting to the king's weakening body. The people, of course, do not know the cause. They only know that their king is failing, and they fear that without his strength, the kingdom will fall into ruin. And so, the whispers begin. The whispers of betrayal, of poison, of something far more sinister than just the natural decline of age. But who, you might wonder, would want to harm the king in such a quiet, covert way? Who among his closest circle could betray him so silently, so ruthlessly? The answer is always the same. A trusted friend, someone who has sworn loyalty to the king, someone who has sat at his table, raised a goblet in his name, and sworn to protect him. In ancient Ireland, loyalty was everything, but so too was ambition. The poisoner is not some outsider looking to take the throne through violence. No, this is someone within the king's own court, someone who has waited for the right moment to strike. King is too ill for his age, too sick for the years of strength he once carried. He stumbles, forgets, becomes frail before his time. His body, once a symbol of vitality and power, is now just a shell. And yet, the poisoner continues their slow work, undetected. In the final days of the king's life, when the truth can no longer be ignored, the silence that once hung over the kingdom breaks. Whispers turn to accusations. The poisoner, once hidden in the shadows, now finds themselves revealed. But by then, it is too late. The damage has been done, and the kingdom must face the consequences of a ruler lost not to battle, but to the treachery of one within his own walls. And so, the tale of the poisoned chalice becomes not just a story of betrayal, but a story of the fragility of trust. The kingdom, weakened by its king's sudden and mysterious decline, faces a new reality, a reality where loyalty is no longer enough. To protect the king, and power must be guarded with more than just words. As the fire crackles in the hearth, and the last sip of wine lingers in the king's memory, we are reminded that sometimes the most dangerous enemies are not the ones you can see. They are the ones who sit beside you, smiling, waiting for their moment to strike. As the moonlight filters through the tall, gnarled trees of ancient Ireland, the world beneath the canopy feels almost timeless. The air is thick with the scent of damp moss, and the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze creates a rhythm that seems to echo with the whispers of long-forgotten tales. The land stretches before you, its rugged beauty undisturbed by the passing of centuries. And yet, within this quiet expanse, hidden behind the rolling hills and dense forests, lies a darker story, a story that is not so much about enemies on the battlefield, but of those closest to you. Tonight, we're about to delve into one of the most peculiar and tragic aspects of the ancient Irish world, the foster relationship. In ancient Ireland, fostering was more than just a way of rearing children. It was a bond that could be as strong as, or even stronger than, the blood ties of family. The foster son, often the child of a powerful clan or an influential ally, was brought into the home of another noble family, raised alongside their children, and treated as one of their own. But while this system of fostering created powerful alliances, it also had the potential to breed the deepest forms of betrayal. You see, in a world governed by honor and power, a foster son could not only inherit the physical strength of his adoptive family, but also the very essence of their ambition. And when ambition is tied to the throne, to the heart of a kingdom, that bond can quickly turn from one of loyalty to one of dangerous rivalry. Let me tell you the story of one such foster son, a young man raised in the halls of a powerful king, nurtured and cared for as though he were a true son of the house. To the king, this foster son represented the future of his line, the legacy that would carry his name and his power long after he was gone. In the eyes of the king, this boy was more than just a child. He was a vital part of the kingdom's future, a symbol of continuity, of strength, and of loyalty. The foster father had no reason to doubt the boy's devotion. After all, the bond between them was forged through years of shared meals, shared stories, and shared triumphs. The boy had been raised in the king's home, had trained with the king's own warriors, and had witnessed firsthand the responsibilities and burdens of leadership. In the king's eyes, the boy was a son in all but blood, a trusted heir, one who would help guide the kingdom through its future struggles. But as with all stories where loyalty is tested, this one takes a dark turn. Imagine the king sitting alone in his chamber late at night, staring into the flickering light of the fire. The weight of the kingdom, of his legacy, presses heavily upon him. He is an aging king now, his body weary, his strength beginning to fail. He is surrounded by allies, yes, but also by threats, both seen and unseen. The kingdom is stable, but how long will it stay that way? What happens when the king's time is over? Who will take the throne? Enter the foster son, the one who had been raised as the king's own, the one who had sworn loyalty and fealty, the one who had been groomed for greatness. And yet, in the quiet spaces between words, in the hidden corners of the hall, there are whispers of ambition. For the foster son, once grateful for the king's care, now looks at the throne with hungry eyes. He sees the power, the authority that the king holds, and he believes that it is his birthright to take it. The kingdom must pass to him, not because of birth, but because of ambition, of the strength he has learned from his foster father. But this ambition does not announce itself with bold declarations. It begins with small shifts. The foster son begins to draw away from the king's inner circle, to surround himself with his own loyal followers. He whispers to the warriors, to the chieftains, and to the advisors, planting seeds of doubt in their minds. What will happen when the king is gone? Who will lead the people? He asks, his voice quiet but persuasive. Slowly but surely, the foster son begins to turn the kingdom's court into a place of tension and uncertainty. Those who once stood by the king's side begin to glance toward the foster son, weighing his ambition, wondering if he might indeed be the better ruler. And all the while, the king, growing weaker with age, is none the wiser. He sees only loyalty in the boy's eyes, sees only the son he raised, the heir who will continue his legacy. But the foster son's ambitions begin to come into sharper focus. His eyes, once filled with gratitude, are now clouded with a darker vision. He wants the throne, and he believes he deserves it more than anyone else. And so, as the king's health begins to deteriorate, the foster son quietly sets his plan into motion. He makes subtle moves, cutting off the king's allies, sowing distrust in the king's leadership. He isn't in a rush. No, he's patient. Power, after all, is a slow game. It's about building trust and then breaking it when the moment is right. The king, meanwhile, still believes that his foster son is the key to the kingdom's future. He continues to rely on the boy, treating him as a trusted advisor, as a son. But there is something changing in the air, something that the king cannot see. The boy's eyes are set on the throne. It is not enough to be a close advisor, not enough to serve as a protector. The foster son now wants to be the ruler. And so, one night, as the king lies in his bed, weakened by years of strain, the foster son makes his move. It is not with a sword, not with a violent coup, but with a quieter, far more devastating action. He moves in silence, using the king's own allies against him. The king's health fails, worsened not just by age, but by the slow unraveling of trust around him. The foster son, now seen as the rightful heir by many, moves to claim his throne. The final betrayal comes when the king, in a moment of frailty, calls for the foster son to stand by his side to reaffirm their bond. But the boy, now a man, looks down at his adoptive father with cold, calculating eyes. He doesn't see a king. He sees a man standing in the way of his destiny. In that moment, the weight of years of loyalty, of love, of shared struggles, all comes crashing down. The boy has grown into a man who no longer sees the king as a father, but as an obstacle. The kingdom is his, and he will do whatever it takes to claim it. The king dies not with the clash of arms, but with the slow suffocation of betrayal. His death is not swift or sudden. It is the result of a gradual loss of power, both political and physical. His kingdom, now in the hands of his foster son, is left in a delicate balance, one that will forever be marked by the stain of disloyalty. As you stand at the edge of the kingdom, the winds blowing softly through the trees, you can almost hear the echoes of the king's final days. How many other kings in history have met their end not at the hands of a foreign enemy, but through the quiet treachery of those they trusted the most? In the cold silence of the night, the shadows of those who rise to power through disloyalty stretch long across the land. The king's death marks not only the end of his reign, but the beginning of a new, uncertain chapter in the kingdom's history. And as we leave this somber tale behind, we are reminded that in a world where loyalty can shift like the wind, the most dangerous betrayal is often the one that comes from within. The night is deep, the moon casting a soft glow over the land. A cool breeze stirs the trees, and the air carries the scent of the earth, rich and alive, despite the long history of those who have come before. Beneath the vast, quiet sky, the past lingers, shadows that stretch long into the future, whispers that are never truly silenced. Imagine now standing at the threshold of an ancient, weather-worn stone hall. The air inside is thick with the stories of countless years, and the low hum of a fire crackling in the hearth fills the space with warmth. But beneath the warmth, there is something else, something deeper. The ghosts of kings past, their memories etched into the very stones, their legacies both proud and tragic. Tonight, we are not only remembering the kings who ruled with strength and wisdom, but those whose fates were sealed by the very laws they helped create. Let me take you back to a time when the law of the land was unyielding, when the Brayan laws, ancient and sacred, dictated everything, from the smallest disputes to the most momentous events, even the lives of kings. The law was clear. A king must remain unblemished, his body perfect, his mind sharp. For in ancient Ireland, the king was not just a ruler. He was the very embodiment of the land, the pulse of the kingdom. To fail him was to fail the land itself. But what happens when the king's body falters? When the sacred laws that uphold the kingdom can no longer protect the ruler they were meant to safeguard? In the end, the very laws that elevated a king to the throne could be the same laws that would bring about his downfall. For in a world so bound by honor and tradition, even a single misstep could unravel everything. This is the story of a king whose fate was sealed not by a foreign invader, nor by the blade of a rival, but by the iron grip of his own laws. A king who, through the failing of his body, was forced to confront the very laws he had sworn to uphold. The king, once the embodiment of strength, now faces his greatest challenge, not from an external enemy, but from within. His body, once a symbol of vitality and divine favor, begins to betray him. Perhaps it is a wound, a scar that refuses to heal, or perhaps it is the slow creeping of age, an infirmity that even the mightiest cannot outrun. And as his body weakens, so too does his connection to the divine, a connection that, in the eyes of his people, is not just symbolic, but essential for the prosperity of the kingdom. In ancient Ireland, the laws of kingship were clear. A ruler who was physically imperfect was no longer fit to rule. A king who was wounded, sick, or in any way marred by weakness was seen as a threat to the stability of the land. The king was expected to embody perfection, not just in mind and spirit, but in body. His health was the land's health, and his strength was the kingdom's strength. So what happens when a king is no longer perfect? When his body, once whole and strong, shows the signs of wear and tear, of battle, of age? The answer, in ancient Ireland, was simple. The king must step down. The laws of succession were not just about family. They were about the integrity of the land. A king who faltered could no longer be seen as the living embodiment of the kingdom's vitality. And in the world of the ancient Irish, that was not a fate that could be allowed to continue. Our king, once a towering figure, now faces the undeniable truth. His body, once perfect, now shows the signs of imperfection. His vision has begun to fail him, his strength to wane. The very essence of his kingship is slipping away, and with it, the health of the land. The crops no longer grow as they should. The cattle fall ill. The rivers no longer flow as freely, as if the land itself has grown tired, weary of the king's failing body. And so, as the king's body declines, so too does the stability of the kingdom. It is in this moment that the laws of succession become cruelly apparent. The king must step down, not because of a foreign invasion, not because of betrayal, but because his body has failed him. The laws demand it, the people expect it, and the kingdom requires it. The king's reign, once filled with promise and vitality, now draws to a close, and with it comes the knowledge that the law, once a protector, has become the very thing that brings about his end. But what does this mean for the king? What happens when a ruler, so deeply tied to the land, is no longer fit to rule? The answer is both tragic and inevitable. The king, whose strength and health once ensured the prosperity of the kingdom, is now cast aside. He is no longer the living embodiment of the land. His body, once a vessel of divine strength, has become a symbol of failure, of decay. In the ancient Irish world, a king who was no longer fit to rule could not simply retire quietly. No, the laws demanded that the king's reign be formally ended. And so, the king must be replaced, not by force, not by bloodshed, but by the unyielding force of the law. His successor is chosen often from among his sons or closest relatives, someone who is seen as physically perfect, someone whose body is whole and strong, someone who can once again restore the balance between the king and the land. And what of the deposed king? What happens to the one who has failed, whose body has betrayed him, whose reign has come to a close? The fate of such a king is not always cruel. In some cases, the king may be allowed to live out his days in peace, perhaps in exile, far from the halls of power. In other cases, he may be forced to live in obscurity, forgotten by the people who once revered him. In the worst cases, the king may face a fate far darker, one where his death is not just the end of his reign, but the end of his connection to the land he once ruled. The ghosts of kings past linger in the shadows of the kingdom. Their stories, once filled with the glory of victory, now echo with the weight of failure. The people remember them not for their triumphs, but for the way they fell, from grace, from power, from the divine connection that had once made them so revered. These kings, now mere shadows, are a reminder of the delicate balance between power and fragility, between life and death. For in ancient Ireland, a king's reign was not defined by how he rose to power, but by how he fell, and whether he could pass on the throne to someone worthy of his legacy. As the fire crackles in the hearth, casting long, dancing shadows across the stone walls of the hall, you can almost hear the ghosts of those kings who were once mighty. Their stories linger in the air, and the lessons they impart echo in the silence. The body is a vessel, fragile and fleeting, and the laws that govern it are both a protector and a tyrant. For when a king's body falters, so too does his reign, and the land must move on with or without him.